Welcome to the Safety Break, the Whitewater Rescue Podcast. We're here to share stories of real river accidents and rescues and find expert advice on how to solve the problems you might encounter in the Whitewater River environment. I'm your host, Jack Diddy, an emergency medicine physician, whitewater paddler, and wilderness medicine educator. Together, I hope we can celebrate successful rescues and learn from our mistakes in a supportive environment. If you have a story to share of a non-fatal accident or rescue, send me an email at thesafetybreak@gmail.com or contact me on our Facebook page, The Safety Break. If you like what you hear, hit the subscribe button and follow us on social media. I hope you learned something valuable in the show. Fucking strainers. Of all the hazards we deal with on the river, these are maybe the nastiest and the hardest to predict. They can show up at any place, any time, often lurking just below the surface where you can barely see them, hiding in blind slots, and they can turn the easiest piece of water into a surprise death trap. They account for about 17% of all the fatalities recorded in the AW accident database. And I bet if you filtered out all the incidents involving true inexperience, the percentage is even worse for seasoned paddlers. In this episode, we're going to hear a story of a strainer encounter from the Beartooth Mountains of Montana. And the next episode features more strainer carnage from Overflow Creek in Georgia. My worst strainer experience involved a river-wide log blocking Muddy Creek, a small and fast tributary to the Cheat River in West Virginia. It was just at the surface and had some fast current leading into it. And after a quick boat scout from an upstream eddy, it looked good to go. I charged up and over the log and caught an eddy just below. But as the next paddler came through, he didn't have enough momentum, spun sideways and lost his edge, and pinned across the upstream side of the tree. I hopped out of the boat and waded out into the waist-deep water and grabbed his PFD, trying to hold his head above the water. But the current was too strong for the both of us. He was stuffed deeper and deeper into the pin, and eventually his face became submerged under the water. As soon as I saw him lose his airway, all I could do at that point was just push downward as hard as I could and hope that he broke through. Luckily, that's what happened. He and his boat both broke through the branches and flushed down and out, making it through without any significant injuries. That was a spooky moment, and I bet almost every paddler listening to this has a comparable moment with a strainer somewhere in their paddling history. The factors that lead to strainer encounters generally involve inattention, indecision, poor boat control or misreading the river, or by running blind or continuous sections of river without scouting. We all make these mistakes, and most of the time we just get away with it. It's an unfortunate reality, but complacency can kill. You have to assume that there could be a death trap strainer in every single bit of moving water that you paddle, and one that wasn't there even yesterday. This doesn't mean that you should paddle in constant fear, but it means you should paddle with constant vigilance. Considering the role that complacency plays with strainer problems, it reminded me of an episode of our podcast from 2023 called Resurgence, an interview with my good friend Adam Herzog after his terrible climbing accident. For those that don't know Adam, he is a lifelong paddler, endurance athlete, kayak and wilderness medicine instructor, a trauma nurse, and paramedic. He took a bad fall in a climbing gym in December of 2022 after a moment of inattention and failing to clip into the auto belay. It was a life-changing injury, but he's made a great recovery. I caught up with him last month for a day on the river and used the opportunity to see what kind of insight he has about dealing with strainers. So before we hear the rescue story today, here's a bit of my conversation with Adam. So welcome back, Adam. Last time I spoke with you, you were recovering from an injury, and we have an episode a couple years ago that gives us a lot of detail about that. But I wanted to bring you back on the show to talk about strainers today. And we have a story about a paddler in Montana that had an incident involving a strainer while solo paddling. So there's obviously a few things that we can learn from the episode, and welcome back. So
thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So tell us what you're doing these days, and maybe a quick update on your injury recovery too.
Yeah, I'm doing really well. I am working at a school as a school nurse locally in Asheville, North Carolina. Still teaching kayaking for the Nolichucky Outdoor Learning Institute, and also teaching wilderness medicine classes at the wilderness first aid level for Noli as well. In terms of my injury recovery, I can't say I'm 100%, but I'm about as close as I think I'll ever be back to, I can hike again, I can run in kind of a limited capacity, doing long bike rides and paddling as much as I want. So I'm feeling really good.
In the story for the episode today, we have this guy that had this strainer issue. How do paddlers approach the risk of strainers on the river? Like, what is your mentality in regards to strainers? Because it's a significant risk, and it's always the unknown hazard that's out there for us.
And the variable too, like it can change overnight or even in a few minutes. So I think there's kind of two answers, and the textbook answer would be you should never run a drop blind, and that would be the kind of, on one end, the more conservative thought process, which is probably the safest. You just don't go over stuff that you can't see the bottom of. And then there's kind of the more realistic answer, which is you mitigate the risk by doing things like eddy hopping and looking over your shoulder, but it's fairly unrealistic if you're paddling steeper whitewater to actually look at everything, because it would just be so time consuming. But I think there's some strategies that we all can and probably should be using. Like, for example, so if say you did ever want to run a drop blind, you can always send like one person out to just get a quick look and efficiently kind of scout, as opposed to an entire group getting out, because you're talking about the difference between a minute or two versus 5 or 10 minutes per scout. And then there's, on the kind of other extreme of just not worrying about it and throwing caution to the wind and just hucking, and which is what, you take the green prior to the hurricane being a really, I think, a good example of familiarity in the way that we often approach that river, where we're, hustling down the thing in like 30 or 40 minutes through the narrows, without really giving much thought at all to the fact that there certainly could be wood and blind spots. I think dam-released rivers lend themselves more to that type of complacency for sure.
Certainly the rivers that get a lot of river traffic, it seems like the risk is generally less. People are more likely to clean stuff out if they find it. You hear about reports of logs on those rivers. So the greater risk obviously is going to be in your rivers that are seeing less traffic, less commonly run. You don't hear reports about them as much,
right? And
there's less people kind of cleaning it up.
Yeah, and maybe that's sort of a self-regulating process. Like, hopefully we're more on that conservative end of the thought process if we're on less familiar things. And if there's more information out there, like using again the green as an example, there's a Facebook page specifically for that river, and so people were really good about posting changes. The problem with that is changes can happen really quickly too, from things like wind and changing water levels and falling trees and things.
Yeah. So if you're going out to run a creek that you haven't been on for a while, what are the conditions that would kind of raise your suspicion a little bit?
Yeah. So over the years, I've really, for my personal kind of safety protocol, I generally avoid rising river levels, especially on smaller creeks. So on days when if it's raining, if the water's already high and it's still raining, I tend to just go play boating on like bigger rivers with like class 3 surfing. I didn't do that when I was 25, but as I got older and older, I just see that as like a very hard risk to mitigate, rising water levels. I kind of think of it as analogous to like, skiing and avalanche terrain in terms of the number of variables are much higher. Another thing would be wind, so kind of paying attention to the wind conditions and the storm conditions. And then like here in the Southeast, we've got this hemlock blight. So I think too about what kinds of wood, what kind of trees proliferate along specific river corridors. And some of those for us locally, if there's a high density of hemlocks, I think more about, changing strainer conditions because of the dead trees.
Is there anything that you carry with you specifically to deal with strainers?
If I'm creek boating regularly, and I haven't really been the last few years, but when I was doing a lot of kind of higher end class 5 stuff, I would typically carry a folding saw with me as well as a pocket knife. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Keep a pain kit, so it consists of a couple of prusiks, 2 pulleys, and some webbing. And I'm not very mechanically kind of engineering minded, and I know that's a weakness of mine, so I actually keep a cheat sheet for a Z-drag, because in most cases the 3-to-1 Z-drag, you're typically dealing with a boat, not a heads down situation. And so just having a resource there if you need it. And it's also good to practice that stuff periodically on dry land.
We'll hear more from Adam again in a bit. But let's get on to our rescue story today. This one comes from Nate Winning on the West Fork of Rock Creek in the Beartooth Mountains of Montana.
So my name is Nate Winning. I'm here in Red Lodge, Montana, which is south central Montana, if anybody's not familiar. And I would say that probably one of the most common things that people might know about my area is that the Clark's Fork of the Yellowstone is our backyard run. That's probably the most notorious one. I've been a paddler for nearly 25 years now in this area. I do kayak instruction and raft guiding and stuff like that in the summers. And in the winters, I am a backcountry ski guide in the Cook City area in Yellowstone National Park. And have been paddling class 4 or 5 whitewater for 20 years. Most of the rivers, I would say, are smooth rock, boulder bed creeks. A lot of them are starting in the alpine, anywhere from 100 foot a mile to, upwards the class 4 or 5 runs on the steep creeks are probably a little bit closer to, 250, 300 foot a mile. Real continuous mountain streams, which I'm sure a lot of us can relate to, rather than, ledge drops and recovery areas. So definitely in the rivers that we are talking about where my incident happened was called the West Fork of Rock Creek. And it's one of my backyard runs, probably takes me, 20 minutes to get to the put-in from the house. And class 4 or 5 nature, steep, 250 foot a mile, very unforgiving, fast pace creek boating. Yeah, cold water. So yeah, that's the character of the backyard runs here. And then some of the bigger rivers, Stillwater River, the Yellowstone River is just right down the road. A little bit more volume, but still smooth rock, mountain rivers. But but back to, the West Fork of Rock Creek, obviously like most mountain streams, high water in the spring, which usually here comes about the first couple weeks in June. First 2 to 3 weeks in June, and then everything starts to taper down to a more moderate level by the 4th of July, I would say.
One of the wild things about Nate's part of the country is the high density of grizzly bears. These things tend to spend a lot of time hanging around these small streams when they're hungry. Now, this story has nothing to do with the bear encounter, but I was really curious how they deal with these while paddling out there.
Oftentimes I carry a thing of bear spray in my lap bag, and when we portage, we pound on our boats with our paddles and yell. It's a motivating factor to run a rapid instead of portage it.
So back to the topic at hand. Here's Nate's account of his incident.
Looking back on the calendar, I believe the date was the 6th of June. The year was 2013. And it was at a medium level. So it was on the way up for the year. Just started to get warm. Water started coming down off of the mountains. And I had run the creek already several times that spring. So My girlfriend at the time, now wife, said that she wanted to go for a hike. And I was like, well, that's perfect. You can drop me off at the put-in, go for a hike. So had this deal with her. She dropped me off at the put-in. I'm paddling down the river, get to a little bit of a constriction in the creek, and drop over a ledge, a small like boulder ledge, and take a log right to the chest, just like as classic as we can all imagine as paddlers. It was a new log, obviously, something that had come in overnight or within the last 24 hours, fallen in off the riverbank or flushed down, possibly. So I come over the ledge and I take it to the chest, and almost immediately the boat gets pulled off of my lower half of my body. I didn't really even have to struggle or anything, just the force of the water just sucked the boat right off my lower half of my body. And here I am, still stuck on the log. So obviously I let go of my paddle, didn't need that anymore because the situation was a little bit more dire than that. And then my body started getting pulled underneath the log. It just kept getting worse and worse and worse until the front of my helmet was creating that air pocket, like just going right over the lip. And then just as you would think, kept going down. Well, my head starts going underwater. When I became fully submerged, I knew that I was going to have to make some decisions. So I fought a little bit once I wasn't able to breathe anymore. And, funny how time slows down at that point. And so I felt around, and what was catching was my 3 life jacket straps on my right-hand side. So evidently the life jacket straps were stuck on the, jail bars, as we might express that. And at that point, I was like, well, okay, I'm going to have to try to cut myself out of this logjam. So like I'd been taught and like I'd been practicing routinely, I had my Gerber river knife right on the safety tab on the front of my life jacket. So I unsheathed it, and I got both of my hands off to the side of my body, and I started sawing at the life jacket straps on the right side. Just kept sawing and sawing and sawing and sawing until I got to this moment where it almost sounded like a gun went off. It just went poof. And the tree released me. But it wasn't over yet, because now my elbow pad strap, the strap was also stuck on one of the limbs. So I was able to finally wiggle my arm out of the elbow pad. I kept wiggling and twisting and wiggling and twisting my wrist until finally the elbow pad slid off my arm, and I still had my knife in my hand. So we're out of the log jam and starting to flush downstream into some pretty fast-moving water with my life jacket halfway on. And I was able to, I was almost done by then. I'd almost given up. So I was able to basically flail my arms and my legs, and I ended up in a little eddy on the left, and I laid there for probably 10, maybe 15 minutes until I was able to, I was probably puking up a little bit of water and whatnot. And I got out of the river. So there I was, the nice thing about it is the hiking trail's right there. So I finally got out of the river, walked back down to where my wife was hiking, and she sees me walk up without any of my gear, basically in a tattered life jacket. I'd already taken my helmet off and bundled it all up. And she happened to be over there talking to some other friends at the trailhead. And I just walked past all of them without even saying hello or how you doing or any of those things. And I threw the rest of my gear in my truck, And I went and sat in the passenger seat until she came and drove me home.
So ultimately, Nate was a little beat up, but it sounds like very lucky to be alive considering the underwater entrapment. He credits at least part of his survival to his equipment. The first was his helmet brim, which bought him a few precious seconds.
I very vividly remember the lip on the front of that shred-ready helmet, and the water was coming down, and it was just kind of kicking it just enough to give me that air pocket to breathe. But that was only just for a moment, you know. That wasn't going to be sustainable as I continually got sucked underwater. But it was very comforting for a second because I wasn't ready to die yet.
The second thing he credits is his knife that was easily accessible exactly when he needed it. My personal practice is to carry a set of good trauma shears inside the front pocket of my PFD, but he felt even this would have been too slow in this situation.
And this is my personal opinion, and I know that everybody's going to have their own on this. If I would have had to open a pocket, that would have been a no-go. That knife needed to be on the outside of my jacket. And ever since then, I still use the Gerber river knife that goes onto the tab on the outside of the jacket. And one thing that I've done, because I feel like one of the complaints, on that setup was that people often lost their knives, right? Because they fell out of the sheath. So 15 years ago, and even before this incident happened, when I started guiding in the early 2000s, I would put a thin strip of duct tape in through the handle and around the sheath to keep the knife inside the sheath. And when I went to grab that knife out of my life jacket that day, that duct tape ripped so freaking fast, dude. And not only that, but the indexing on that blade, that one little nub on the Gerber river knives, oriented my hand the appropriate way to be sawing on it with the serrations, you know? I feel like I thought about all these things while I was underwater, you know, the nanoseconds. And if I would have had to unzip a pocket and try to fumble through, I don't know if I would have had that time.
And of course, the other learning point here, maybe the elephant in the room, is the danger of solo paddling in general.
A couple takeaways from that, you know, that people might come up with right away is what the heck are you doing solo boating, right? You know, everybody might ask that question. And yeah, I solo boat a lot, and especially on my home creeks. So it is what it is, right? Everybody's got their own take on that. I try not to if I don't have to, but you got to fit it in when you can fit it in. And, you know, on my local creeks, I'm probably doing dozens and dozens of laps a year. So I feel good. You know, I'm never really scared or anything when I put on. The other takeaway that I often think about, Jack, too, is this. If somebody would have been behind me that night, it could have been disastrous. If somebody would have dropped in behind me, could have knocked me unconscious, and then I wouldn't have had any of the bearings that I needed to save myself there. And it would have just kind of compounded the problem. So, you know, I thought a lot about that too. If anybody would have been behind me that day, they could have just KO'd me when they came in, you know, and then it would have really been a terrible situation, you know? So I make that as my excuse on justifying it in my head. I don't know.
Now, we could probably devote a whole episode to the issues around solo paddling, but I think overall those issues are fairly obvious. I'm certainly not in any position to condemn it. Many of my outdoor experiences, including paddling, are solo endeavors, partly by choice and partly by the circumstance of my strange work schedule. But if you go out alone, you just have to understand that you're sacrificing a huge part of your safety net, and there's not a lot of margin for error. There are multiple tragic stories of solo paddlers killed by strainers or sieves, in which a partner could have easily helped dislodge them. When solo, you're also outsourcing any possible rescues to strangers, and there's some clear ethical issues with that. Having said all that, the reality is that solo paddling happens a lot, and it's worth talking about. Here's more of my discussion with Adam.
Well, I guess I think it's a personal choice, and it's a personal choice that should be made realizing and being aware of the risk. And I think it is in most cases objectively more dangerous. It would be hard to argue that point. But there are situations in which either the risk is mitigatable. For example, toning it down in terms of the difficulty that you take on. And I think there's also situations where paddling with other people, can be maybe not more dangerous, but different kind of dangers. There was a really good essay written years ago on one of my favorite old websites called OregonKayaking.net, and it's still online, and it's called The Dangers of Paddling with Others. And it's kind of tongue in cheek, but it makes some really good points. And that is that, like, for example, when you're paddling alone, you tend to be 100% focused. There's just zero distraction. So I have found that even when I was paddling harder whitewater by myself, I rarely, if ever, made mistakes because I was so focused on what I was doing. There's really no distractions. You don't have to worry about helping anybody else out and putting yourself in harm's way for that reason. I think, again, as long as you're able to kind of be aware of the risk, it can be, I don't know that I would say no one should ever do it. And you're right, that's just not the reality.
Yeah, I think we had talked earlier or a couple weeks ago about this, and just the idea that you may be willing to take risks that you don't take when you're with a group, or that you don't typically take when you're with a group. So there's also the forced pacing of a group that might be different than the pacing that you were comfortable with on the river. Yeah. Those are things that I've run into before.
There's obviously you're not going to have any peer pressure, so that is completely eliminated. And I've been in situations before too where I've been faced with the decision. That is either paddle by myself or paddle with a crew that I'm not familiar with. And I would often choose to paddle by myself because, again, there's no false pretense that there's any extra safety buffer. Whereas if I was paddling with people who I don't know, they may not have the same level of awareness that I do. They may not have the same kind of personal protocols that the teams I'm usually used to operating with do. And so in many cases, I would make that decision. But again, that's a personal choice. The other thing too is there's this kind of, I think this can be somewhat of a false narrative too, of once you're up into the hard class 4, class 5 level, you're always on your own anyway. And I think you had a really nice interview with Drew Ostell. That was a really good counterpoint to that, and kind of a case study of, they say that particularly on the North Fork, as you're always alone on the North Fork. And I think most of the North Fork locals have stories of people who have been rescued with boat tows and things like that. So that's where I guess I'm coming from with go into it with eyes wide open. Like, don't try to tell yourself that this is safe, because it is not safe. Kayaking is very weird in that it can be incredibly forgiving, but certainly the safety buffer is very razor thin. Mm-hmm.
The bottom line is that the stakes are clearly higher when you paddle alone. And if you choose to do so, you have to adjust your focus and your judgment accordingly. It's also a really good idea to let somebody know where you are and when to expect you back. Well, let's finally get back to Nate to hear how he cleaned everything up the next day.
And then I guess to, kind of to cap off the story, obviously the next day I was super bummed because now I lost my Liquid Logic Stomper and my nice Werner Powerhouse. I'm like, well, crap, it's really hard to go ask anybody else to go bomb down and look for it. So the next morning I had my wife drive me to the trailhead again, and I started hiking up and down the creek. And I got probably 1.5 miles, 2 miles down from where I swam or where I got stuck. And I see the bright green tinge in my kayak. I'm like, oh, this is so sweet, This is so sweet. Maybe it's still intact. Who knows? And then all of a sudden my thoughts went to my paddle. We all love our paddles. So I'm like, oh, shoot, I lost my paddle, though. I get down to where my boat was, and my boat and paddle were perfectly lodged into these rocks together, nonetheless, unscathed, completely unscathed, basically. After, a couple miles of class 4 plus whitewater. And so anyway, that was a good thing. I had to come back to town, go over to one of my friends' houses, one of my paddling buddies, as I hobble in with ski poles and say, hey, will you come out to the creek and grab my boat and my paddle out of the creek? I had a hell of an accident. And then I guess try to put a little bit of a, funny twist at the end. After we got my boat and paddle out, my buddy came with me up to where the log jam was, which I hadn't been to since the accident. And my elbow pad was still hanging there on the tree. And he was able to walk out on there and recover my elbow pad, which I probably never wore again. And, made it through the weekend. And then probably about the next Monday or something like that, I come along that tree and cut it up. Once I was able to walk around and get rid of that thing and got back on the creek right away. This is super fun.
So good for him for pulling that out of there. That's never a bad idea if you find a life-threatening strainer in play on the river, and you have the time and the tools to pull it out. Here's my final thoughts for today. In thinking about this strainer problem, I wanted to call the main human error here complacency, either being unaware or unconcerned about potential risks, or not taking the effort to address those risks. But as Adam alluded to earlier, it's more than that in some situations. When you're on a grueling and difficult river or creek with multiple scouts, hard rapids, high physical exertion, and maybe a time crunch due to dwindling daylight or weather, it's often a calculated decision to run something blind. It's faster and you save energy. But there is always that little bit of risk. And this is part of the essence of hard paddling. In one of our recent episodes, Jeff Snyder referred to these risks that we take sometimes as gambling with all the marbles. It's a gamble we usually win, but it just takes that one strainer in the wrong place to make you lose it all. Next time you're sitting in the eddy, peering over your shoulder and getting ready to drop over the blind horizon line, think about all that's at stake. Only you can decide if it's worth it. Thanks for listening today, and stay tuned for our next episode soon. We're going to be talking more about strainers with a day of epic carnage on Overflow Creek in Georgia. Thank you for listening to The Safety Break, the Whitewater Rescue Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button and click follow on our Facebook page so that we know that you're out there. I'm also looking for more stories. If you know of an interesting non-fatal river accident or rescue, send me a few details by email, safetybreak@gmail.com. It doesn't have to be dramatic or life-threatening, just something that we all might be able to learn from. I'll see if we can turn it into an episode. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the river.